So one thing we haven't talked about yet is we've sort of been treating the user story as this sort of interchangeable unit of work. But of course, in practice, that's probably not the case. Some stories are going to be more difficult than others to implement, maybe because they require a design change to the app, like adding a new type of model, maybe because the story deals with a behavior that's complicated to code or has a lot of interactions with other parts of the app. So in practice, in extreme programming, when we're talking about stories, we're also talking about points as a measurement for how hard the story is to do. Now, there's a lot of methodologies for how you should assign points and what points mean. I'm going to tell you my very opinionated version. This is not the only version, but it works well. And I think particularly as you're getting started, I would recommend that you take it seriously. In your team, you're looking at a story. Everybody comes to an understanding about what the story says has to be done, and you all vote. How do you vote? The most low-tech way possible. If you've ever played rock, paper, scissors, you've seen this before. We're all going to vote on whether the story is worth 1 point, 2 points, or 3 points. And we go 1, 2, and then you hold up some number of fingers and you just compare what everybody says. If you're thinking that a story should be worth more than 3 points, to me, what that really means is you actually don't know how hard it is. And you need to break that story down into smaller sub-stories that you're more confident assigning points to. How much is a point? Like, how long does a 1 point story take to implement? This is completely up in the air and it's up to your team to decide. But in my view, there's no such thing as a story that's too small. You know, if you want to say something like a 1 point story is something that one pair of developers who are pair programming could finish it in like an afternoon or maybe even less. Velocity is just the moving average of how many points your team delivers per iteration. Again, there's many ways to calculate it, but an exponentially weighted moving average is typical. The reason it's useful is because once your team sort of gets into a rhythm and you get good at estimating how many points a story is worth, you can predict how much work you're going to get done over the next few iterations. And you can sit down with a customer and prioritize stories saying, look, in the amount of time we have until the next launch, we're not going to have time to do all these features, but we have a pretty good estimate of how long each one's going to take. You help us prioritize them and put them in the right order. Velocity is something that exists within your team, right? And that's because it's within your team that the concept of how much a point is worth makes any sense. So if your team decides that a 1 point story is one pair of developers working in an afternoon, maybe a 2 point story is a pair of developers working for an 8-hour business day, a 3 point story maybe takes 2 days. It doesn't have to be linear, right? But the idea is that you are only pointing stories if you have a really good grip on how hard the story is going to be to do, what the specific tasks are going to be required. And for that reason, I think 1 point stories are good. If I do a 1 point story, it means you could ask me, tell me the list of actual tasks you have to do. Like, tell me which files you'll think you'll have to touch or the nature of the code you'll have to write in each place in order to make that happen. If I can just write down the answer and tell you about it, to me, that's a 1 point story. And as we'll see, part of the reason for adopting that philosophy is that this whole method of estimating effort really is about reducing the amount of uncertainty. A 3 point story doesn't have to be 3 times as hard as a 1 point story, but you have to be able to confidently say what makes it a 3 point story specifically, as opposed to saying, gosh, that sounds hard. We better give it 3 points, right? So you can always break stories down. And by the way, let's connect this to Cucumber and the idea of breaking a story down. If I have a story that begins with creating a movie and ends with the movie having a bunch of reviews, there's a lot of easy ways to break that down, right? One breakdown is when I create a movie, then I should be able to see it, look for it, whatever. That's one story, one set of scenarios. Then there's a different one that begins with, given a movie exists, right? So essentially, in some cases, the given steps of one scenario presuppose that there are other scenarios that are actually testing what it does, right? If I say, given these movies exist, then by assumption, somewhere there are tests that actually check, does the process of creating movies actually work? So by doing that, you can sort of partition a long story into a bunch of smaller stories. And when I mentioned epics before, that's the idea of an epic. From the user's point of view, that may be one long workflow, but from the point of view of how you test it, you can actually break it into discrete chunks and essentially have each chunk begin where the previous one leaves off. And the goal of doing all of this is to get better over time at estimating how much work your team can do. That's why you measure velocity as a moving average. Now, of course, in a real system, there will be hundreds of user stories and many hundreds of scenarios. So these are actually categorized sort of into different buckets. There's the backlog, which is stories that have been assigned points. So your team has met, you've sort of done the little voting thing, you look for outliers, you discuss, you come to agreement, maybe you subdivide it. And you've also talked to the customer to prioritize how important that one is relative to other stories. Because as you allocate your time, you want to do the highest business value stories first. There's the icebox, stories that you know you have to do, but you have not yet discussed with the team, so they don't have points. We say that they have not been pointed. If they haven't been pointed, maybe they've been prioritized, but you don't have a good idea of how long they'll take. And some of those stories, depending on what the customer decides, they may or may not get done later. But it's a placeholder for all the stuff we're not working on right now, but we may or may not have to work on later. Related to that is that there might be a spike. The customer says, for example, you know what I would really like? I would like to add payments to my movie application for whatever reason. So somebody on the team has to go off and explore, what does that mean? Do I use Stripe? Do I use some other payment system? What's the nature of the integration? What are the points where the integration will have to touch our app? And the goal of a spike is basically not to write any code except the code needed to sort of test drive what the integration would be. Once you're done with the spike, you come back to your team with an explanation of, here's what we're going to need to do. You throw away all the code you wrote because you almost never write the correct code the first time you're experimenting with an external system. But a spike in that regard is a kind of story because it takes time. And it takes time for the developers. That means that it goes into the critical path of ultimately delivering the feature to the customer. There's also a lot of other things besides the stories themselves. So, we talked about user stories and how they have this synergy with lo-fi sketches and storyboards. So you actually want a central place that all of this stuff can live together. So a place where you can keep track of the features you're working on. Those are stories that have been sort of vetted as being smart. They have business value. You've assigned points to them. You've prioritized them. What about bugs? Bugs do take developer effort, but the prevailing sentiment in Agile and XP is that fixing a bug should not be worth points. Even though the bug goes through the same life cycle as a story, right? Because you're changing code, you're getting your team to sign off on it. But you shouldn't really give yourself credit for fixing a bug because then you're sort of getting double credit for writing the feature in the first place in a way that doesn't work and then sort of giving yourself credit again when you actually fix it. Chores are things that are necessary for your team, but they don't have any business value or points. So if you have to refactor some code because its maintainability has gotten really bad, or if, as in the case of an app I'm dealing with right now, the app is like 2 to 3 major versions of Rails behind, and some libraries and gems that it relies on are going to be deprecated soon. So I need to upgrade the entire app. The customers of iApp hopefully are never going to see that. They'll only see it if I mess it up because then there's going to be bugs. But there's no business value to my customers for me keeping my app maintainable. So that would be an example of a chore. And then there's also all these other things that go with all of these tasks. There'll be design documents, there'll be notes from meetings. There's integrations with GitHub so that when a story is finished, you can sort of keep track in the repository of which branch corresponded to it, most of which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. So in my practice, I love to centralize this stuff with a tool called Pivotal Tracker. Like most tools, it's free if your project is public and your tracker board is open source. But let me just give you a little walkthrough of how it works. It's at pivotaltracker.com. You can create a free account there. We use it in CS169L to track project work with the customer. This is a screenshot from a real project. It is one of my projects. And as you can see, there's a lot of stories. The backlog is the stories that are in the sort of middle column. Those are stories that have been pointed for the most part and prioritized. The icebox has a whole bunch of other stories and bugs and chores and things that I may or may not ever get around to. There's one story that I have open right now so you can see the details. And let me just sort of walk you through how this helps track the different states of a story and helps with things like velocity estimation. So every story can be in one of several states. It can be a story that has not yet been started. So that's usually what's in my backlog. The story has been pointed, but has not yet been started. No one's working on it. Once somebody starts working on a story, it goes into the active iteration, which is the leftmost column. So the story state now shows as started, and the next possible thing I can do is to click finish. Finish just means that I believe the code and tests are at a point where it's ready for other people on my team to look at. So that would be the finished state. And once it has sign off from my team, people have looked at it, the next step is the delivered state. Delivered means the story is deployed in such a way that the customer can see it, that they can interact with the new feature. Most of the time, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's on the production site. usually it means something like it's on a staging site, some other copy of the app that is not the real copy, but that the customer can sort of play around with and give me feedback on the feature. And assuming the customer is happy with it, then the feature would get accepted. The customer might also say, actually, that's not quite what I wanted. And you either need to polish it up or just reject it and start over, which you hope is rare if you've been actually following the advice of keeping the customer involved the entire time. So every story can have points. Here is a 2-point story. Tracker lets you set up how many points are allowable to be assigned. I tend to have my stories set so that it only allows me to assign a maximum of 3 points, because I really do believe that if I think it's more than a 3-point story, what that really means is I'm not sure how hard it is. And I need to break the story down and find what are the parts of the story that I'm uncertain about and concentrate the sort of uncertainty there. Maybe I have to go do a spike on something. I'm actually going to have to go do this soon because one of our customers wants us to integrate tap to pay so you can pay with your phone. We already accept credit cards. We already have a relationship with Stripe. Tap to pay works with Stripe, but there's a new piece of hardware that we have to integrate. It has a different API, and I just need to go spend some time looking at it. Stories can also have tasks. This is really useful because, for example, if the story has to do with a particular view should contain such and such, there's probably like 2 or 3 little places in the app that I have to touch in order to actually implement that story. And tasks lets you actually, at a very, very fine granularity, say, I need to add this validation to that model. I need to add this view to that code. I need to add these fields to that form. Like literally a step-by-step process of what you want to do. This is why I love 1-point stories. A 1-point story is one where there's like 3 or 4 tasks. Each one is pretty well circumscribed, so it's very predictable how long it'll take. And so being able to track the tasks and sort of check them off as you do them, it's like having a little mini to-do list that goes along with each story. A story can be part of an epic. So I mentioned that if you need to break down a story into pieces, Tracker can still keep track of how many stories in that epic or how many points in that epic you have yet to implement. And there's like a little green progress bar that you can see that the progress bar gets longer as you get stories accepted that make up that epic. And when they're all done, the epic sort of goes away. It moves into a completed epics panel. There's a whole bunch of bugs. We all have bugs. I have Pivotal Tracker set so that bugs are not allowed to be given points. All bugs are worth 0 points. You can override that, but for the reasons I mentioned before, I don't recommend it as a matter of practice. And I have a number of chores, things where I have to fix the code in some way that makes the structure better or that gets the code ready for some sort of an upgrade. The customer is never going to see the effect of that, but it's important for me for the project. So chores in my world don't have points either. There are other screens in Tracker that I'm not showing you here, but it shows things like a burn down chart, which is until the next release, what are the stories you can do? It has the ability to optionally move stories into the iteration for you. So for example, once your team has stabilized, Tracker will calculate your velocity. As stories are marked as accepted, it basically calculates how long it took the story to go from being started to being accepted. And on the basis of that, it can calculate the velocity for your whole team because your whole team has access to this board. And you have the option to automatically have it move prioritized stories from the backlog pane into the iteration pane. So it's almost like a queue that as stories are getting checked off from the active iteration, new stories are automatically being pulled in. And you can even have it assign stories pseudo-randomly to people, which I'm usually not in favor of. It is amazingly powerful. And in this course, we tend to use GitHub issues for the final project where you're actually going to be implementing a bunch of stories, largely because the stories you're going to be implementing are small enough in scope that the machinery provided by Tracker is maybe a little bit too much. But in 169L, when you have a team working on many stories over 6 iterations, and you need to keep track of who's doing what, you can actually attach design documents or any other kind of documentation to any story. There's integration with GitHub so that when a story is marked as accepted, the corresponding branch can be associated with it in GitHub and you can close that branch out. On a real project, you need something that's a little, in my opinion, a little heavier duty than GitHub issues. So check it out if you want. And if you take 169L with us, you'll be able to use it there.